Since my book published last year, I've received hundreds of emails from people who want a kinder and more empathic culture. I think of them almost as a quiet majority under the surface of often a very loud, mean surface, right? And so I always encourage them to make their empathy loud and to make it visible. I think this is especially important for leaders in really any space, whether you're the leader of a school, a family, a town, or a company. I work with lots of organizations, leaders in companies and school systems, hospital systems, you name it, who want to inject more empathy into their workplace cultures. And the first thing that I tell them is that it has to come from the top, right? Because the behaviors that people in leadership model and make visible and highlight and celebrate and elevate don't just become visible to people on the ground, they become more contagious. So the third and final kind of principle that I want to leave you with is that simply understanding that we can build empathy is the first step towards doing so. I'm sure some of you are familiar with my incredible colleague, Carol Dweck, and her work on mindsets. Really briefly, this is the idea that our beliefs about ourselves can become self-fulfilling. Prophecies, right? If you believe that something like your intelligence is a fixed trait, you might not be motivated to work on it. But if you believe that you can grow, then you might be more motivated to put in effort. Well, as soon as I got to Stanford, Carol and I decided to see whether the same was true of empathy. In one study, or set of studies rather, we presented people with one of two essays meant to impart different beliefs about how empathy works. The first, empathy like plaster is pretty stable over time, was meant to induce people to feel like empathy was a fixed trait, that no matter what they did, they couldn't build it. The second essay, empathy is changeable and can be developed, was meant to convince people that empathy was a skill. After they read one of these two essays, we put participants through an empathy obstacle course, full of situations where it might not come naturally to connect with somebody else. We found over and over again that people we had just convinced that empathy was a skill worked harder at it. For instance, they spent more time listening to stories told by someone of a different race. And they told us they would invest more energy trying to understand the opinions of someone they disagreed with politically. Again, to us, this is an optimistic finding because it suggests that people can build their empathy. I also think it's a somewhat ironic finding. As I've just been telling you, sort of the classic wisdom from my field and beyond is that empathy is a fixed trait. Well, it turns out that maybe that's not just wrong, but that belief could be toxic and counterproductive. Because if you think of empathy as a fixed trait, you might be discouraged from working on it, even if that work could benefit you and the people around you. By contrast, if you understand that empathy is a skill, well, then you might see that you have the opportunity, and I would say maybe the responsibility, to work on it in ways that adhere to your values and the person you would like to become. Hopefully by now you understand that empathy is a skill and can start to think about how you want to point it in your own life. I would argue that maybe that's never been more important than now, or at least not in a long time, as the world reels, of course, from this global pandemic and the long-lasting, unpredictable effects that it will have on all of us. I want to close today by thinking a little bit about disasters and what they reveal about us, humanity. It turns out that catastrophes are a collision point for two stories about human nature. The two stories start in the same way. They start by saying that disasters rip away our comfortable routines and take away also social norms and conventions, and they reveal the true human nature underneath. But the two stories then go in totally opposite directions. One story you might have seen in movies about disasters, where what is revealed is not very good. In those movies, after and during disasters, people fall apart and tear each other apart. They panic, they act selfishly, and social order collapses. Well, a different story emerges from the historical record. A book that I think is so timely these days and just wonderful in general is Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell. Solnit goes through a number of different disasters: the earthquakes in San Francisco in 1906 and 1989, the bombing of London during World War II, Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, and over again, she finds that that story about human nature seems to be contradicted. In fact, it turns out when the lights go out and the rules go away, people turn up for each other. People help strangers and neighbors, and they form pop-up communities of mutual aid. Because along with our routines, what else is ripped away? Some of the separateness that usually governs our lives. Disasters often put us in the same boat, and sometimes quite literally. So Solnit, for instance, talks about the Cajun Navy, a group of private boat captains, some of them just having these little tiny rafts, who went back through the wreckage over and over again, trying to find anybody who they could save, and often risking their own lives in the process. Of course, COVID-19 is one of the great disasters of our time. And I think that a lot of us have been focused on the first story that it reveals. The people who have acted in selfish ways. We see headlines about folks who are hoarding toilet paper or flouting social distancing measures. And that is true, that's really happening, and it's really can be destructive. But I think we should definitely ensure that we're also paying attention to the widespread acts of kindness that this pandemic has brought. So all around the world, people have found ways to help each other, just as Solnit writes about. A lot of this happens on Google spreadsheets. Google spreadsheets may be not the most inspiring genre most of the time, but all around the world, people have created spreadsheets to help their neighbors who might be more vulnerable to the pandemic. People have turned out for each other in ways that I've almost never experienced in my lifetime. And so yes, although this disaster has harmed us in so many ways, I think it's also revealed some of our best sides, as our worst moments sometimes do. Now, there's of course a massive difference between COVID and disasters like Katrina or 9/11, which is that those other disasters happen quickly. Now, they might affect us for a long time, but they happen quickly. COVID is a slow disaster that will continue to affect us and the people we care about and people who we don't know for years or even decades to come. And I think that a big and vital question of our age will be whether we can take the acts of kindness that we've seen and hopefully that we've taken part in during the catastrophe and turn those into habits of kindness instead. So I'll just close by saying that if you are looking for ways to practice kindness, to take some of the topics that I've discussed in this talk and make them practical for yourself, it just so happens that this week I'm holding a sort of digital event called the Global Kindness Challenge. It's actually based on a seminar that I teach at Stanford called Becoming Kinder, that has a series of little empathy building exercises that I assign to students. Well, this week I feel like, because this is such a lonely and painful summer for so many people, I want to share those same exercises with people around the world. So if you're interested in taking part or spreading the word, please feel free to join us. It's been really inspiring seeing people's stories thus far. Great, and with that, I'll just thank all of you for your time and attention, and I really look forward to your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamil. How has the data on empathy changed in other countries outside of the United States, and is there a comparative change?
It's a great question and one that we don't have an answer for. So there's cross-sectional data that there's data from all around the world at this point using that same empathy scale that I described. So for instance, I can tell you that as of 2017, the US ranked, I think 8th or 9th in empathy among 63 nations that were sampled, which is not bad, I think was impressive. And we also have longitudinal data over the decades from within the US. But unfortunately, we don't have the combination of those two things. So we don't have long-term data from around the world that we would need to answer that very good question in a satisfactory way. Now, I think people are asking these questions a lot more and using that scale a lot more around the world. So as the years go by, we'll be able to chart change around the world, not just within the US.
And where can people find the empathy index if they're looking for more information about that? And do you have information about the breakdown of that index in terms of demographics or other ways to kind of cut and look at that?
There's all sorts of information about this. So the scale is called the Interpersonal Reactivity Index. It was developed by a psychologist named Mark Davis, who is at Eckerd College, Eckerd, I believe in Florida. And his site has the IRI on it, so you can download it and try it out anytime you want. There's all sorts of information about demographic breakdowns on the IRI. So, generational and age differences, gender differences are the two that I'm most aware of. But, like I said, hundreds of thousands of people have taken this test by now. So there's lots of information about it.
And Amelia just asked, have there been reevaluations at all of the questions that are in there now that the survey is more than 40 years old?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when the study came out sort of pointing to this empathy decline, I interviewed Mark and I kind of asked him, do you think any of these questions are outdated? And he said, well, take the test, see what you think. And, I have to admit, the questions are they feel pretty universal to me. There have been some attempts to add scales to them to test the validity in new contexts, and it's a pretty robust scale. So what do I mean by robust? Well, the way that you'd want to test something like this is you want to say, well, wait a minute, someone's telling me they're empathic. How do I know to believe them? Maybe that's just someone who's really full of themselves, right? Telling me that they're maxing out on all sorts of positive qualities. But it turns out that you can also measure empathy physiologically. So like I could give someone an electric shock and see how the person next to them, whether that person's palms start to sweat as a physiological sign of their sharing of the person's emotions. I can, and in fact do, scan people's brains while they observe others experiencing emotions, and I see how much their brain states match. You can also look at people's propensity to act in generous ways. And people's score on the IRI actually tracks all of those other metrics, right? So that's why we believe that it's a relatively valid scale, because it's not just people telling us something, it's people telling us something that also corresponds to their behavior.
I'm going to connect a few questions because we've had over 60 that have been asked. Are there certain requisites for empathy? And for example, what extent do trust, vulnerability, self-awareness, emotional intelligence have to be present to flourish? And how would you persuade an analytical person or someone who doesn't think empathy is a value worth growing? How would you convince them that it is?
Yeah, I do this all the time. I mean, yeah, like I said, I actually work with lots and lots of organizations of all types. And let me tell you that different people in different sectors have different viewpoints about empathy and its value. I've heard people give me all sorts of stereotypes about empathy, especially in workplace settings. Sometimes in Silicon Valley, I've heard empathy is a feminine quality, or empathy will interfere with our bottom line or my ability to give people feedback that's honest. It's so easy to debunk those beliefs because in essence, the opposite is true in every case. I mean, empathy turns out to be a massive competitive advantage in workplace culture, especially in retaining and finding and recruiting talent. It tracks all sorts of other positive qualities within relationships, within professional and personal relationships. It tracks positive health indices. It's really easy to make the case to someone that they should be empathic for themselves. And that's fine. I mean, I also hope that that's not the only convincing argument for empathy, right? Because empathy produces not only psychological safety and sort of opens the door for vulnerability in the person who's expressing it, it also obviously, produces a more positive climate for the people around us. And so, I hope that people are motivated both to do things that are healthy for themselves and for others.
And you brought up myths. Is there such a thing as too much empathy? Can you relate and share other people's feelings so much that it starts to negatively impact you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I tell people that empathy is a skill and they can build it, sometimes I get a question, so should I just turn my empathy up to 11 all the time, like in This Is Spinal Tap, right? And just leave it. It's like, no, absolutely not. That'd be a disaster. I mean, I used to live in New York City, and just to think about walking down one Manhattan block while taking on everybody else's pain, I mean, you would just collapse, right? And that's not always the way to help other people either, right? I don't want my therapist sort of like crying when I'm in a session with him and saying, gosh, your life really is terrible. Right? Like, he doesn't need to share my struggles, but he does need to care about them. And this is where I think some of the differential or distinctions between types of empathy matter so much. I have a whole chapter in my book around medical empathy. It turns out that one of my children spent a lot of time early in her life at a NICU. And the physicians and nurses and social workers there were these empathic superheroes to us. The care that they gave us was astounding and so meaningful. And I started to worry about them. I was like, how can they possibly keep this up? And so I went and shadowed them for my book, and I found really what a struggle it is to sort of be in those kind of fire hose of human suffering types of spaces and keep connected. And so I researched a lot about empathy and burnout. And what I found was that really, so you might remember, Mei Ling, that I was talking about sharing other people's emotions, like vicariously catching their feelings, and then compassion, or sort of caring for other people without feeling as they do. It turns out that sharing other people's emotions is a risk factor for burnout, fatigue, and even sort of symptoms of trauma. By contrast, feeling for other people, empathic concern, is a protective factor against burnout. So it turns out that the way that one empathizes matters a lot more sometimes than how much they're empathizing, right? I mean, it's not just a volume knob that we're turning up. If I can torture the metaphor even further, I'm old enough to remember stereo equalizers. You remember where you could like turn up or down different frequency ranges. And I think one of the pieces of the art of caring in a sustainable way is tuning ourselves to types of empathy that are more useful. I realize this is a long answer. The last thing I'll say is that some of that tuning can be done through certain meditation practices.
And you answered another question someone had, which is, what is the difference between empathy and compassion? Can you also differentiate empathy from sympathy?
Yeah, sympathy is a tough one scientifically because its definition has really flip-flopped a lot over the years. So it became really popular among like the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers like Adam Smith and Hume, and they would talk about sympathy the exact same way that people now would talk about emotional empathy, as this like really visceral sharing of other people's emotional states. Then the term empathy took over in like 1909 in English, and people stopped using sympathy the way that they had, and now they use it to mean something more distant, almost like pity. I just shy away from it altogether because I feel like its definitional wobble is too much for me. And trust me, as someone who studies empathy, I deal with a lot of definitional wobble, but to go, the way I just see sympathy used in totally incompatible ways. So I like to stick with empathy, which is what psychologists and researchers have really focused on much more.
So I'm glad that you just talked a lot about this time that we're in and what happens in crisis. And so I think many people have voted this question as a result. So is the solution to increasing empathy solely just about individual behavior, or are there kind of collective actions that we could take to make society more empathic? And there were a couple of other questions also around that in terms of, if you're the leader of an organization, how can you promote it? And are there grassroots examples that we've seen outside of corporate America?
Oh gosh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so one of the myths that I think we're always worth debunking is that empathy is an individual sport, right? That we're all only responsible for the empathy, for our own empathy, right? I mean, in fact, we influence each other massively and constantly, and especially people in power. I think whether they're in power in government or organizations, companies, et cetera, have the opportunity, and I would say the responsibility, to really be stewards of their culture. And again, one way to do that is to really make empathy, is to reward empathy, to make it sort of, to incentivize it, to make it part of make it part of the structure of our culture, right? Whether that's our culture at work or at home or at school or wherever, right? To really value it in visible and concrete ways. And that's on leadership. Then what can the rest of us do in terms of collective actions? Well, I use this phrase a lot, make empathy loud. And people are like, well, I don't want to. I'm too embarrassed. And is it unempathic to brag about how empathic I'm being? And my whole thing is, you don't have to make your own empathy loud. Make other people's empathy loud, right? I mean, I think there's so much coverage, so much attention paid to cruelty in our culture. And for good reason. We need to be aware of the pain that people cause each other so that we can do something about it. The fight for justice in the US and beyond in the last months has been one powerful example of that. But I also think it's so important to elevate and show people not just what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. To bring to light examples that you see in your life or that you see in your culture of people acting kindly and empathically. Right? I think that those positive examples can influence people just as much as negative examples, and influence them in a way that also includes some hope.
In terms of teaching empathy, there are a few questions like, how can parents and grandparents teach empathy to kids? And when can that begin? Is that something early or later in life?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of programs to try to do this now. The University of Wisconsin has a terrific kindness curriculum that has been rolled out in hundreds of schools. Socio-emotional learning is, of course, an explosive field within education. So there's lots of practices that start with helping kids recognize and be precise about understanding their own emotions. So, emotional intelligence work, the Ruler program out of Yale is one such example, using contemplative techniques like meditation to be mindful and understand our own feelings. I think that's often the beginning of understanding other people's feelings for kids. As the parent of a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, we try this all the time. We try to create a map of emotions and ask our kids what types of emotions they felt today, and ask them to identify emotions that characters in books feel, characters in movies that their friends have felt. I'll try to not go on for too long here. We also, to the point of making empathy visible, we have a jar at our dinner table, and every day after dinner, we write about something kind that somebody did. And we it's a little bit of a gratitude exercise, but it's pointed at kindness and empathy in particular. And then we put it in the jar and we read it at the end of the year. So there's just these little things that we can do. Again, I think that such an important feature here, not just in teaching kids, but for all of us, is just to think about how to go beyond isolated actions towards habits. Can you build time in your day or time in your week? Can you add something as annoying as a Google Calendar reminder to help you stay on track? It's really easy to lose track, especially in this overwhelming, stressful time that we're living in. But it's so useful and surprisingly useful to try to make kindness and empathy habits when we can.
Going back to the survey that we started with, has any research been done on people who took the survey in the 70s and 80s and what the diversity of their communities looked like? This person's curious about whether self-reporting empathy in a survey changes when your community starts to become more diverse, and then maybe you have an increased realization that you might be racist or sexist, and honesty changes with self-reporting. So what is there a margin of error there for people that over-report?
It's a huge and very important question. I'll try to be brief here. So being surrounded with other people who are different than oneself used to be thought of as the magic bullet for increasing empathy. This is what was known as contact theory. I think was it Mark Twain who said that travel is that prejudice and prejudice can't survive travel, or something like that, which is why so many people need it. Basically that in essence, when we experience prejudice, we don't know people well enough. And if we did know people better, our prejudice would melt away and our empathy would grow. That's true sometimes. It's not true all of the time. In fact, sometimes when people enter a more diverse setting, if they feel, for instance, that a new group of people is encroaching on their opportunities or their neighborhoods, for instance, they can become more prejudiced and more exclusionary. it seems as though the fulcrum on which useful or non-useful contact occurs is whether that contact is personal and meaningful. So simply being surrounded by people who don't look like you might not be a great tool for empathy, but getting to know them might be a better tool for empathy. And there's evidence that, in essence, when people form meaningful relationships with others, I don't know whether their IRI scores change, because I don't know whether their general empathy changes, but certainly their empathy towards towards people who are unlike them along those dimensions can increase.
Another person asked if you're familiar with David Brooks' Nation of the Weavers project. I wonder if you might speak to any overlaps between your work on empathy and his work on social cohesion, or relatedly, if you could talk about empathy as it relates to Putnam's Bowling Alone.
Yeah, I'm a friend of the Weavers. I think that their work is terrific. And, you know, in fact, the kindness challenge that's out on the internet today is called Disagreeing Better, sort of an attempt to find someone who we disagree with, and instead of sniping at each other about our opinions, interviewing them about the way that they came to have those opinions. The idea being that we can, even if we continue to disagree, we can sort of find the humanity and even some common experiences underneath our disagreements, which is basically, I think, quite aligned with the Weaver mission. Bowling Alone was a big inspiration for me. I do think that, you know, there's an epidemic of loneliness that all sorts of people are writing about right now, including the former Surgeon General just had a book come out about the epidemic of loneliness. And isolation and loneliness, ironically, can turn us inward. They can make us feel like we only have energy for ourselves and make us lose out on opportunities to connect with other people. So yeah, I think that they're sadly intertwined and can create a vicious cycle.
This might be a fast one, but a few people missed the citation for your study about the drop in empathy that we've experienced.
Oh, sure. It's Sarah Conrath, Konrath, and her colleagues. It was published in 2011. I'm happy to share with you, and if people want to follow up, where they can follow up with me, and I'll send it to them.
Great. And then I think this will be our last question, just looking at time. So in the book, Living Danishly, there's a statement that one of the elements of happiness that people in Denmark has comes from the trust in government and public institutions. They know when they become sick, the healthcare system will take care of them. If they lose their job, the government can help with funds or skills. What's your view on that experience and culture and how that influences how empathic we are, and how that the best examples come from our leaders?
Yeah, so I mean, there aren't great data on sort of social safety nets and their relationship to empathy. And I don't want to editorial, obviously I have many opinions, but I don't think that people are here to necessarily just listen to my opinions. I mean, one thing that I'll say is that stress and anxiety can decrease our empathy, right? They can, again, like loneliness, turn us inward. And I think that, in essence, when we are struggling and when we feel as though we are alone and have been abandoned by people around us, that doesn't seem to me like a good soil in which empathy can grow, right? If we feel so atomized that there's no connection to a broader culture, whether that's from a social safety net or from not encountering people in meaningful ways as much, or just from, you know, being on internet comment sections for too long. I mean, I think that there are lots of experiences that can foster a sense of alienation that I think, you know, is part of the erosion of empathy we've seen in modern times. And one that I think is reversible. You know, I really want to hammer that point home. I think that we've been headed in a difficult direction when it comes to empathy for a long time. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that we could push back.
Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and for being with us here today.
It's been my total pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks everyone for being here and for your great questions. I'm wishing everyone well during these difficult times.